What does the layout of Starbucks, black pearls in a jewelry store, and diagnosing COVID all have in common? That's what we're going to talk about in today's video. Let's jump into it. Let's start with the black pearls. In Predictably Irrational, Dan Ariely writes about the story of Salvador Asal, a pearl salesman who tried to sell a large collection of black pearls. However, despite his best efforts and his history of being a pearl salesman, he couldn't shift a single one. You see, back in the 1970s, there was no market for black pearls. They were a strange gunmetal grey rather than the pearly white pearls that people were familiar with. And up until that point, black pearls were largely only sold in obscure Polynesian islands. So what did our pearl salesman do? Did he drop the price, offer a discount, or discontinue the line altogether, assuming that the market had spoken and just accepting the fact that there was no demand for black pearls? No. In fact, he did the exact opposite. Instead, what our pearl salesman did was use his contacts to get black pearls shown in a Fifth Avenue window in a jewelry store with an extortionately high price tag. He took out large, glossy pages in magazines showing black pearls alongside diamonds and rubies and other precious gems. As a result of these efforts, those black pearls that were previously obscure and had no demand for them suddenly became the hottest item on everybody's list. All the wealthiest and most famous people in Manhattan had to have black pearls and couldn't be shown at a party without them. You see, the trick that our pearl salesman used was to not treat the black pearls like the cheap jewelry that they were, but instead to associate it with the established high-end jewelry that already existed, the diamonds and the rubies. By doing so, the value of the black pearls became tied to the value of those diamonds, and as a result, he managed to change the perceived value of those items. But what does all of this have to do with Starbucks? Well, I'll get to that in a second, but first, let's talk about how this relates to diagnosing patients with COVID-19. During the pandemic, of course, the main thing on doctors' minds was diagnosing COVID-19. But because COVID is a pretty complicated disease and the symptoms weren't the same for everybody, it meant that a lot of different diseases could potentially be lumped together with COVID, even if they shouldn't have been. As a result of that, research in medicine and psychology has shown that doctors may have misdiagnosed many patients during the pandemic by lumping together multiple diseases and putting them all under the umbrella of COVID-19. In other words, if they heard that a patient had already been diagnosed with COVID, if that same patient showed other symptoms that weren't necessarily the most common COVID symptoms, those symptoms would just be attributed to COVID rather than earning a separate diagnosis, which may have resulted in different treatment and therefore better medical care. Basically, what I'm saying is that during the pandemic, many doctors over-relied on the initial piece of information they got, which is that their patient had previously been diagnosed with COVID-19 and therefore were more likely to misdiagnose future symptoms because they thought that they were all just a result of COVID. Now, how does this relate to the black pearl story that I just told? Well, it's because they both share the same psychological bias, which is anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is when people over-rely on an initial piece of information and therefore don't judge future pieces of information objectively. In the case of the black pearls, when those black pearls were shown on the poster alongside diamonds and rubies, the value of them became anchored to the diamonds and rubies. When people saw black pearls in the future, they failed to objectively judge the value of them and instead used that initial anchor of diamonds and rubies to judge their price. For the doctors, it was the initial information of them learning that the patient had COVID-19 that therefore led to misdiagnosis when other symptoms started to present. But what does any of that have to do with the Starbucks shop layout? Well, let's talk about it. When Starbucks first launched in the 1970s, they were actually a bean and coffee equipment seller rather than a coffee shop. But eventually when they did start selling coffee, it didn't take off in a massive way. Customers coming in were anchored to, well, Dunkin' Donuts, because that's what they were familiar with. Cheap, low quality coffee that was sold at an extremely low price. When customers would enter this premium coffee shop Starbucks, they didn't really understand it. They didn't understand why they had to pay such a high price for coffee. And well, it wasn't until the late 80s when they were bought by a guy called Howard Schultz that Starbucks really started to take off. A few years prior, Schultz had visited Milan and realized that there were 1,500 coffee shops in that one city alone. He was totally inspired by the way that Italians approached coffee and he tried to bring that back to Starbucks. What he did was completely revolutionize the brand from a bean and equipment selling company to a cafe that didn't just sell coffee but sold espresso, cappuccino, latte. He also changed changed the layout and the decoration of the Starbucks shops to reflect this premium nature. Starbucks was not Dunkin' Donuts, and that had to be clear in every visual aspect of the store. And this was further cemented in 2003 when Starbucks started selling foods in their shops. They weren't simply selling American donuts, instead they were selling croissants, pastries, and other European baked goods in order to raise that premium feel in Starbucks. As a result of that, Starbucks were able to shift away from the anchor of Dunkin' Donuts and other cheap coffee brands that people were familiar with. By investing heavily in the layout of the shop and of the menu and the type of coffee that they served, they were able to differentiate themselves in order to set themselves a new price anchor. And, well, because of Starbucks' success, future coffee stores are now anchored to Starbucks rather than trying to differentiate themselves from Dunkin' Donuts. These days, modern coffee chains like Costa and Cafe Nero decorate their shops to reflect Starbucks, and as a result of that, they have their prices anchored to Starbucks' prices, which is why people entering those stores don't feel shocked by the cost of their coffees. So, what does the layout of Starbucks, black pearls in a jewelry store, and diagnosing COVID all have in common? Well, the answer is the psychological principle of anchoring, which is the idea that we tend to over-rely on the first piece of information we get and therefore judge all future pieces of information in reference to that first one. For the black pearls, that anchor was seeing it alongside diamonds. For COVID-19, it was doctors seeing the information that the patient had already been diagnosed with COVID. And for Starbucks, it was about establishing a brand new anchor so that Costa and Cafe Nero could then use Starbucks as their anchor for prices in the future. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, can you give me a thumbs up down below, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.